There is a specific, bone-chilling realization that occurs when the person you have centered your entire world around reveals themselves to be the architect of your destruction. For 15 years, I believed I was living a fairy tale, the kind of love story that movies are made of, built on a foundation of mutual sacrifice and shared dreams. I was Sarah, a high-end architect whose designs defined the city skyline, yet my proudest creation was always the home I built with my husband, Michael. I was the one who pulled extra shifts, who took the freelance contracts that kept us afloat when he was struggling to find his footing, and who invested every cent of my savings into the business venture that would finally make him the success he craved. I thought I was his partner, his cheerleader, and his confidant, never suspecting that while I was tirelessly laying the bricks for our future, he was busy dismantling them from the inside. But the most bitter pill to swallow wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was the realization that I had given him the very tools, my money, my connections, and my unwavering trust, to replace me. They say that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, but they haven't seen what happens when that woman is also a master of structural design. When the walls finally came crashing down, Michael discovered too late that while he was playing with matches, I was the one who had already engineered his exit. And he was going to find out that the foundation he stood on was never truly his. I had been away on a week-long business trip to Chicago, finalizing a major design contract for a new commercial complex. It was a project that would have solidified my reputation as the firm's lead architect. I had been planning to come home a day early, eager to surprise Michael with the news of my success, and finally enjoy a quiet evening in the home we had built together. I wanted to tell him that we were finally secure, that our sacrifices had paid off, and that we could finally start taking those trips we had been talking about for years. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioner. As I walked through the front door, expecting to find Michael working in his home office, I was met with the unmistakable, suffocating scent of cheap perfume, a scent I had never worn. A sense of unease washed over me, a sharp prickle of intuition that I had ignored for too long. I followed the sound of soft laughter and clinking glasses toward the back of the house, toward the sunroom that overlooked the garden I had personally landscaped for our anniversary. My steps were silent, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. As I rounded the corner, the world stopped. Michael was there, slumped in the plush armchair I had picked out just for him. And sitting on his lap, her hands tangled in his hair, was his assistant, a woman I had hired, a woman I had mentored, and a woman I had trusted with the keys to our house. They were laughing, their movements intimate and unashamed, oblivious to the fact that their fairy tale was about to undergo a structural collapse. But it was the conversation that followed that truly shattered me. "She'll be in Chicago for at least another 24 hours, Michael said, his voice dripping with an arrogance I didn't recognize. "By the time she gets back, the transfer to the new offshore accounts will be complete. She's too busy being a workaholic to notice a few missing digits. In a month, she'll come home to an empty house, an empty account, and an empty life. By then, I'll be long gone, and you and I can finally start our real life." I stood in the doorway, invisible, listening to the man I had dedicated my entire adult life to, describing the systematic theft of my hard-earned savings and the callous destruction of my marriage as if it were a simple business transaction. The initial wave of nausea hit me, followed by a sudden, intense stillness. The heartbroken wife who had dreamed of a romantic homecoming died in that hallway, and in her place, the architect took over. I didn't scream. I didn't confront them. I didn't even drop my bags. I simply turned around and walked out of the house. I sat in my car, staring at the front door, my hands steady on the steering wheel. I had a mountain of evidence of his infidelity, his fraud, and his blatant embezzlement sitting in my memory. I had the truth, and for the first time, I had the blueprint for his absolute downfall. If Michael wanted to gamble our life on a secret, he was about to find out that the house always wins, and I was the one who owned the house. I didn't drive back to Chicago, nor did I return to the house that night. Instead, I checked into a sterile, anonymous hotel a few miles away, paying in cash. I needed a space completely disconnected from the life I had built, a place where I could safely dismantle the woman I had been and construct the woman I needed to become. I sat at the small veneer desk in the corner of the room, opened my laptop, and began the forensic deconstruction of my marriage. For the next 10 hours, I didn't shed a single tear. In my profession, when you discover a critical flaw in a building's foundation, you don't cry over the concrete, you draft a demolition plan. I logged into our joint accounts, my firm's financial portals, and the personal servers I maintained for Michael's business. What I found was a sprawling, meticulously orchestrated web of financial infidelity. Michael hadn't just been sleeping with his assistant, Emma. He had been using my credit lines to secure massive loans for his new venture, quietly transferring liquid assets into offshore accounts in his name and preparing to leverage our home, the house I had paid for entirely, as collateral for his exit strategy. He was planning to bleed me completely dry, file for divorce, and leave me saddled with the insurmountable debt of his failed ambitions while he walked away a wealthy man. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the city skyline in bruised shades of purple and orange, my plan was fully formed. I took a hot shower, dressed in my sharpest suit, and drove back to my house, perfectly slipping into the character of the exhausted, devoted, and entirely oblivious wife. When I walked through the front door, the scent of cheap perfume had been aggressively masked by the smell of fresh coffee and bleach. Michael was standing in the kitchen, wearing a crisp button-down shirt, looking like the picture of domestic perfection. Emma was sitting at the kitchen island, tapping away on her iPad, playing the role of the diligent assistant. "Sarah, you're back early," Michael exclaimed, his eyes widening in a flawless simulation of pleasant surprise. He crossed the room and pulled me into a tight hug. The physical contact made my skin crawl with an absolute, violent revulsion, but I forced my arms to wrap around his waist. I pressed my face into his shoulder to hide the terrifying emptiness in my eyes. "The Chicago negotiations wrapped up faster than expected," I lied, my voice muffled and artificially weary. "I'm completely exhausted. I just wanted to come home." "Well, I'm glad you're here," he murmured, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "Emma and I were just finalizing the quarterly projections. I'll wrap it up so we can have the whole weekend to ourselves." "Good morning, Sarah," Emma chimed in, offering me a bright, sickeningly sweet smile. "Congratulations on the Chicago deal." "Thank you, Emma," I replied smoothly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I appreciate you holding down the fort while I was away." They thought they were the smartest people in the room. They believed their performance was impenetrable, utterly convinced that my dedication to my career made me blind to the reality of my own home. I let them believe it. Over the next 3 weeks, I delivered the greatest acting performance of my life. I played the loving wife to perfection, nodding sympathetically when Michael complained about his stressful work hours, and thanking Emma for her dedication to his business. Every time they exchanged a secret glance or a covert touch, I logged it away. I allowed them to grow comfortable, complacent, and arrogantly bold. Meanwhile, behind the thick, soundproof doors of my downtown office, I assembled my war council. I didn't hire a standard divorce attorney. I hired a cutthroat corporate litigator who specialized in high-net-worth asset recovery and fraud. Together, we built an invisible, ironclad legal fortress around my wealth. I quietly transferred my intellectual property, my firm's equity, and my personal inheritances into blind trusts that Michael could not touch. Protecting my assets wasn't enough. I needed to neutralize his ability to attack me. My attorney drafted a separation agreement disguised as a complex corporate liability shield. It was a masterpiece of legal misdirection, spanning over 150 pages of dense, suffocating corporate jargon. The trap was elegantly simple. I needed Michael to sign away his rights to my remaining assets and claim full, sole responsibility for the massive debts he had secretly accumulated. To get him to willingly sign his own execution order, I had to make him believe he was saving himself from my destruction. On a rainy Tuesday evening, I came home looking genuinely distraught. I threw my briefcase onto the floor, poured a large glass of scotch, and sat at the dining room table, burying my face in my hands. Michael, sensing the shift in my normally unflappable demeanor, hurried into the room. "Sarah, what's wrong? What happened?" "It's the Chicago project," I said, my voice trembling with manufactured panic. "There was a catastrophic structural failure in the initial surveying phase. The developers are threatening a multi-million-dollar gross negligence lawsuit against my firm. It's bad, Michael. It's really bad." I watched the color instantly drain from his face. The parasite inside him panicked at the thought of the host dying before he could finish feeding. A lawsuit? Can they come after our personal assets? The house? My business accounts? My lawyers think they might, I cried, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. Because my name is tied to your business credit lines, if my firm goes under, the creditors could freeze everything. We could lose it all, Michael, everything we've built. He began to pace the length of the dining room, his breathing shallow. He was terrifyingly transparent. He wasn't worried about my career or my emotional well-being. He was exclusively terrified that my fabricated downfall would wipe out the offshore accounts he was relying on to start his new life with Emma. We have to protect the money, he said, his voice tight with desperation. There has to be a way to sever my business from your firm's liability. There is, I whispered, reaching into my leather portfolio and pulling out the massive, 2-inch thick stack of legal documents my attorney had prepared. My legal team drafted a post-nuptial severance and liability transfer. It immediately legally separates our financial identities. It transfers all of the joint debt to your name, but it also completely shields your business, your credit lines, and your private accounts from my lawsuit. If you sign this, no matter what happens to me, you walk away completely untouched. He stopped pacing and stared at the binder. I knew Michael intimately. I knew he was lazy. I knew he hated reading complex documents, and I knew his greed would absolutely blind him to the details. He saw exactly what I wanted him to see, an emergency escape hatch from a sinking ship. If I sign this, my money is safe. He asked, his eyes locked on the paperwork. Completely, I replied, sliding a pen across the polished mahogany table. But we have to do it tonight, before the developers officially file the injunction tomorrow morning. The notary is waiting in the car outside. He didn't hesitate. He didn't call his own lawyer. He didn't even read the first page. Driven by pure, unadulterated selfishness, Michael sat down, opened the binder, and began aggressively signing his name wherever there was a sticky tab. He thought he was outsmarting me. He thought he was securing the stolen funds for his new life. He had no idea that buried within those pages was an irrevocable admission of his financial embezzlement, a total waiver of alimony, and a clause that legally transferred the entirety of our home and my firm's assets back to my sole ownership. He was willfully accepting the entirety of the marital debt, while signing away his right to every single penny he thought he had stolen. When he finally capped the pen, he let out a long, heavy sigh of relief, offering me a sympathetic yet deeply patronizing look. I'm so sorry you're going through this, Sarah, but we have to be smart. We have to protect our future. We do, I agreed smoothly, a cold, sharp smile finally breaking through my facade as I pulled the signed documents back toward me. And trust me, Michael, the future is completely secured. With the ink dry on the separation agreement, the countdown to Michael's public execution officially began. Over the next 48 hours, my legal team moved with the silent, lethal efficiency of a tactical strike force. Using the irrevocable clauses Michael had so eagerly signed, my attorneys contacted the banks, the offshore holding companies, and the credit bureaus. They presented the legally binding post-nuptial severance, effectively freezing the hidden accounts, clawing back the embezzled liquid assets, and transferring the entirety of the newly acquired multi-million-dollar loans directly and solely into Michael's name. He was entirely unaware that the fortune he thought he had successfully stolen was already evaporating into the ether, replaced by a mountain of insurmountable debt. To him, the world was spinning exactly as he had orchestrated. He continued to play the role of the sympathetic, supportive husband, offering me hollow words of encouragement regarding my impending corporate lawsuit. He assumed I was drowning in legal panic, too paralyzed by the thought of losing my firm to notice anything else. His arrogance was so profound that he didn't even attempt to hide his excitement for the upcoming weekend. Saturday evening was the annual Vanguard Architectural Gala, the most prestigious industry event of the year, attended by the city's top developers, venture capitalists, and elite socialites. Michael had purchased a platinum table months ago, using my money, naturally, with the explicit intention of using the event to launch his own independent consulting firm. He planned to step out of my shadow, announce his new venture, and subtly introduce Emma to our social circle as his managing partner. He had casually suggested I stay home, claiming the stress of the lawsuit would make a public appearance too taxing for me. I had agreed, offering him a frail, exhausted nod. He left the house at 6 o'clock, dressed in a custom tuxedo, smelling of that same cheap cologne. He kissed my cheek, told me to get some rest, and walked out the door to start his new life. An hour later, I stepped out of my master bath, shedding the exhausted housewife facade for the final time. I slipped into a stunning, floor-length emerald gown, a dress that felt less like evening wear and more like armor. I clasped a diamond necklace around my throat, pinned my hair back with absolute precision, and applied a slash of deep red lipstick. When I looked in the mirror, the woman looking back was cold, untouchable, and entirely devoid of mercy. I arrived at the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel just as the dinner service was concluding and the keynote speeches were beginning. The room was a sea of glittering chandeliers, clinking crystal, and hushed, wealthy chatter. I stood in the shadows near the rear entrance, watching Michael hold court at the center table. He was glowing. Emma was seated right beside him, wearing a dress that was entirely inappropriate for a corporate gala, her hand resting brazenly on his thigh beneath the tablecloth. He was laughing, clinking his champagne flute against the glasses of the major investors he was actively trying to court. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone and announced Michael's name, welcoming him to the stage to present his highly anticipated new vision for urban development. The applause was polite, standard for industry events. Michael stood up, buttoned his jacket, shot a beaming, conspiratorial smile at Emma, and strode confidently onto the stage. He gripped the edges of the acrylic podium, looking out over the sea of faces with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had successfully conquered the world. "Thank you," Michael began, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom sound system. "Tonight is about the future. It's about building something that lasts. For years, I have worked behind the scenes, supporting the infrastructure of others. But tonight, I am thrilled to announce the launch of my own independent firm, a venture built on transparency, innovation, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. And I couldn't have done it without my incredible managing partner, Emma, who has been the true foundation of this new chapter." He gestured toward Emma, who offered a demure, blushing wave to the crowd. "I couldn't agree more, Michael," I said. My voice didn't come from the crowd. It came from the secondary microphone stationed at the edge of the stage. The sound technician, whom I had generously compensated earlier that afternoon, had smoothly activated my feed. The entire ballroom went dead silent. Thousands of eyes shifted from Michael to me as I stepped out of the shadows and into the harsh glare of the stage lights. The emerald gown caught the light, and the quiet gasp that rippled through the audience was palpable. Michael's face went entirely slack. He gripped the podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "Sarah," he whispered into his microphone, his voice trembling, the confident facade shattering instantly. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to support your commitment to transparency," I said, my voice carrying a terrifying, icy calm that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. I walked slowly toward the center of the stage, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished wood. Because if you are asking these investors for their capital, they deserve to know exactly how you built the foundation of this new chapter. I didn't wait for him to protest. I pulled a sleek silver remote from my clutch and pointed it at the AV booth. The massive digital screen behind Michael, which had previously displayed the elegant logo of his fake new company, flickered. Suddenly, the screen was filled with high-definition, blown-up images of bank ledgers. For the past 18 months, Michael has been building his independent firm using a highly innovative financial strategy, I announced to the captive, stunned audience. I clicked the remote. The screen shifted to show the fraudulent loan applications bearing my forged signature, followed immediately by the offshore wire transfers. He has been systematically embezzling from my firm, forging my signature to secure multi-million-dollar lines of credit, and funneling the assets into offshore accounts in an attempt to defraud his own marriage. A collective, horrified murmur swept through the room. I saw several prominent venture capitalists physically push their chairs back from Michael's table. "Sarah, stop," Michael hissed, stepping away from the podium, his face flushed dark red with a mixture of rage and sheer panic. "Turn it off. Are you insane? You're ruining everything." "I'm just getting started," I replied smoothly. I clicked the remote again. The screen changed to a crisp, undeniable photograph I had acquired from the private investigator. It was Michael and Emma, caught in a deeply compromising, intimate embrace on the balcony of a luxury hotel that was paid for with my corporate card. Emma let out a sharp, piercing shriek from the floor, throwing her hands over her face. The socialites sitting at the surrounding tables openly turned to stare at her, with expressions of absolute disgust. "And this is Emma, his managing partner," I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly through the speakers. "A woman whose primary contribution to this new venture was entertaining my husband in the house that I paid for, while plotting to drain my accounts while I was out of state." "You can't do this," Michael shouted, his composure completely disintegrating. He looked at the investors, spreading his hands in a frantic, pathetic plea. "She's lying. My money is secure. My firm is completely independent." "About that," I said, turning to look directly at him, lowering my microphone just enough so my voice felt incredibly intimate, yet loud enough for the first 10 rows to hear every syllable. "That liability shield you signed on Tuesday. The one you didn't read because you were too busy drooling over your escape plan." Michael froze, the color draining from his face so rapidly he looked as though he might pass out. "It wasn't a liability shield, Michael," I said, offering him a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. "It was a post-nuptial severance agreement. You confessed to the financial fraud in writing. You legally relinquished your claim to all joint assets, our home, and my firm. And most importantly, you accepted sole legal and financial responsibility for every single penny of debt you accumulated for this little startup of yours. My lawyers froze your offshore accounts this morning. The stolen money has been returned to my firm." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly, his eyes wide with a terror that was deeply, profoundly satisfying to witness. "You are bankrupt, Michael," I whispered into the mic, the final nail in the coffin. "You are millions of dollars in debt, your professional reputation is entirely destroyed, and you are leaving this marriage with exactly what you had when I met you. Nothing." I turned away from his trembling figure and looked down at the crowd. The silence was heavy, oppressive, and totally absolute. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption," I said, my tone shifting back to the polished, professional cadence of the city's leading architect. "Please enjoy your evening. And to any investors looking for a secure place to put their capital, I strongly suggest you look elsewhere." I handed the microphone to a stunned stagehand and walked down the steps. The crowd literally parted for me, stepping aside as if I were royalty. As I walked toward the exit, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. Michael was desperately trying to grab the arm of a prominent developer, begging for a moment to explain, but the man pulled away in revulsion and motioned for security. At the platinum table, Emma was frantically gathering her purse. She took one look at Michael, a man who was now publicly disgraced, utterly broke, and drowning in debt, and practically ran for the side doors, abandoning him the exact second his stolen wealth evaporated. I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the Plaza Hotel and stepped out into the cool, crisp night air. The city hummed around me, vibrant and alive. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for 15 years was gone, left in pieces on the ballroom floor. I hailed a cab, slid into the back seat, and told the driver to take me home. My home. The morning after the Vanguard Architectural Gala, I woke up in my own bed in my own house to a profound and absolute silence. It was the first time in 15 years that the air in my home didn't feel heavy with the invisible, suffocating weight of another person's expectations, lies, and entitlement. The media fallout from the gala was swift and entirely contained to Michael's side of the blast radius. My firm released a brief, legally vetted statement confirming that my assets and the company's holdings were secure, and that Michael was no longer affiliated with our operations in any capacity. The divorce proceedings, which I had anticipated might drag on for months, were remarkably brief. When a man has zero assets, zero leverage, and a mountain of corporate debt that he legally bound himself to, he cannot afford the retainers required to fight a prolonged legal battle. Michael's court-appointed attorney took one look at the post-nuptial severance agreement, verified my forensic audit of his embezzlement, and essentially advised his client to surrender. The judge signed the final decree with a look of thinly veiled disdain directed entirely at Michael. He walked out of the courthouse looking hollowed out, wearing a suit that was already beginning to look slightly too large for him. I didn't feel pity, and I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing at all, which, I realized, was the ultimate form of victory. But as the dust settled, I recognized that remaining in the house we had shared was not an option. Every room held a memory of a sacrifice I had made for a man who didn't exist. I didn't want to walk past the sunroom where he had held Emma, and I didn't want to cook in the kitchen where he had lied to my face over morning coffee. Within a week, the house was on the market. Thanks to my meticulous landscaping and custom architectural renovations, it sold in 3 days for significantly over the asking price. I decided I needed a clean slate, a geographical and emotional reset. My firm had recently secured a massive, highly coveted contract to spearhead a new waterfront commercial redevelopment project in Seattle. Originally, I had planned to oversee the project remotely, but I walked into the managing partner's office and requested to be transferred as the lead on-site architect. 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to the Pacific Northwest. I bought a stunning, industrial-chic loft in a converted warehouse overlooking the Puget Sound. It was the antithesis of the sprawling, manicured suburban mansion I had left behind. It had exposed brick walls, massive steel beams, and floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the cool, gray, coastal light. It was raw, authentic, and structurally flawless, a space that felt incredibly honest. The healing process was not an overnight phenomenon. It was a slow, deliberate reconstruction of my own identity. For the first few months in Seattle, I threw myself into the waterfront project. I spent my days on construction sites in a hard hat and steel-toed boots, breathing in the scent of wet concrete and salt water. But more importantly, I started to rediscover who I was when I wasn't busy playing the role of the provider. I started sketching again, just for myself, sitting by the water on Sunday mornings. I explored the city's art galleries, took weekend hiking trips up into the mountains, and slowly realized that I had spent the last decade and a half carrying a massive, invisible boulder on my back. Now that it was gone, I felt dangerously light, almost as if I were learning how to walk all over again. It was during the 6th month of the waterfront project that I met Julian. The development required the expertise of a specialized structural engineering firm to manage the complex seawall integrations, and Julian was the lead engineer assigned to my architectural team. From the moment he walked into the temporary site office, pulling off a pair of worn leather work gloves and unrolling a set of blueprints, I knew he was entirely different from anyone I had ever been involved with. He was 48, tall and grounded, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of quiet, steady confidence that doesn't require a megaphone to announce itself. Our first interaction was a professional disagreement. I had designed a sweeping, cantilevered glass atrium for the main pavilion, and Julian politely but firmly informed me that the wind shear off the sound would compromise the structural integrity within 5 years. "It's a beautiful design, Sarah," he said, his eyes scanning the schematic before meeting mine. "It's brilliant, but gravity and wind don't care about aesthetics. If we adjust the load-bearing columns by 3 degrees and anchor them into the bedrock here, you keep the visual impact, and the building actually stays standing." I stared at him, momentarily caught off guard. I was so used to Michael, who either blindly agreed with me because he wanted my money or patronized me to stroke his own ego, that Julian's approach felt completely foreign. He wasn't trying to compete with me, nor was he intimidated by my position as the lead architect. He was simply offering a genuine, equal partnership to build something strong. "Show me," I said, leaning over the table. That professional mutual respect slowly and organically blossomed into a profound personal connection. We spent long evenings in the site office, poring over schematics and drinking terrible coffee. We talked about architecture, about the cities we had traveled to, and eventually about the lives we had lived before we ended up in Seattle. Julian had been divorced for 5 years. His marriage had ended amicably, a simple case of 2 people growing in opposite directions. He spoke of his ex-wife with respect, a trait that spoke volumes about his character. When he finally asked me to dinner, it wasn't at some flashy, pretentious restaurant designed to show off his wealth. He took me to a small, hidden Italian place by the marina where the owner knew him by name. Sitting across from him that night, sharing a bottle of wine and laughing until my sides ached, I experienced a revelation that practically brought tears to my eyes. This was what it felt like to be with an equal. Julian was highly successful in his own right. He didn't need my money, my firm's connections, or my professional shadow to hide his own insecurities. He didn't view my brilliance as a threat to his masculinity, and he didn't need me to shrink myself so he could feel large. He valued me exactly as I was. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying the relationship. I didn't have to manage his emotions, audit his ambitions, or silently fund his lifestyle. With Julian, the affection was effortless. It was the difference between trying to paddle a leaking boat upstream and simply setting a sail to catch a steady, reliable wind. As the months turned into a year, my life in Seattle transformed into a reality far more beautiful than the fairy tale I thought I had lost in that suburban sunroom. Julian and I began spending our weekends together, exploring the coastline, cooking meals in my loft, and building a foundation of absolute, unshakable trust. He knew the story of my past, he knew the scars it had left, and he respected the fierce independence I had fought so hard to reclaim. He never tried to cage me, he simply stood beside me, admiring the way I flew. I had spent my entire adult life believing that love required sacrifice, that to be a good partner, I had to pour every ounce of my energy into someone else's foundation, even if it meant my own walls were crumbling. But as I sat on my terrace one evening, wrapped in one of Julian's oversized sweaters, watching him point out the structural lines of a distant bridge against the twilight sky, I realized I had finally found the piece of the blueprint I had been missing. True love doesn't tear you down to build itself up. It doesn't require you to be the sole architect of the relationship's survival. True love is two builders, standing side by side, looking at the same horizon, and deciding to build an empire together. 2 years after I arrived in Seattle, the waterfront commercial redevelopment project was officially completed. It was the crown jewel of my career. The grand opening was a massive civic event, attended by the mayor, city council members, and the top developers on the West Coast. As I stood on the podium, watching the ribbon being cut, the coastal wind swept off the Puget Sound and crashed against the sweeping, cantilevered glass atrium I had designed. It held perfectly steady, anchored deep into the bedrock, unbothered by the sheer force of the elements. I looked down into the crowd and found Julian. He was standing near the back, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, watching me with a quiet, unwavering pride. He hadn't asked to be on the stage with me, and he didn't need to co-opt my moment to validate his own worth. When our eyes met, he simply smiled and offered a subtle nod. In that single, quiet exchange, I felt a profound sense of peace that no amount of professional success could ever buy. I was completely, unapologetically whole. A month after the ribbon cutting, I received a formal invitation from the National Institute of Architects. I was being awarded the prestigious Visionary Design Medal, and the ceremony was being held back in the city I had left behind. Initially, I considered declining. My life was in Seattle now. I had no desire to revisit the ghosts of my past. But as I sat on my terrace, looking at the formal gold-embossed lettering of the invitation, I realized that avoiding the city meant I was still letting the memory of Michael dictate my boundaries. I hadn't just survived the destruction of my old life, I had masterfully engineered a better one. I deserved to stand on that stage and accept the recognition for a career I had built with my own 2 hands. Julian flew back with me. He didn't come as a shield or a bodyguard, he came as a partner, excited to celebrate my achievement. The city felt different when we landed. The streets I used to walk with the heavy, suffocating burden of my marriage now just looked like ordinary streets. The skyline I had helped design was beautiful, but it no longer felt like a monument to my sacrifices. It was just a place I used to live. The morning of the ceremony, Julian had a breakfast meeting with an old engineering colleague, so I decided to take a walk through the downtown architectural district. The air was crisp, the sidewalks bustling with the frenetic, ambitious energy I used to thrive on. I stopped at a high-end, bustling cafe on the corner of 5th and Main, a place I used to frequent to buy imported espresso for Michael when he claimed he was too exhausted to leave his office. I ordered a black coffee and stood near the pickup counter, scrolling through emails on my phone. Sarah. The voice was thin, hesitant, and completely stripped of the booming arrogance that used to define it. I turned around. Standing a few feet away, holding a cardboard tray carrying 4 oversized, complicated latte orders was Michael. The physical transformation was jarring. The slick, custom-tailored suits and the expensive, perfectly coiffed hair were gone. He was wearing a slightly frayed, off-the-rack dress shirt that looked a size too big, and his face was deeply lined, carrying the heavy, gray exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept peacefully in years. He looked like an entry-level junior assistant, because, as I quickly realized from the plastic corporate badge clipped to his belt, that was exactly what he was. Without my money to fund his fake executive lifestyle, and saddled with millions in debt from the offshore fraud, he had been forced to take whatever low-level drafting job he could find just to survive the garnishments. He stared at me, his eyes wide, a frantic mixture of shame, regret, and a pathetic, desperate hope pooling in his gaze. He looked at my tailored designer coat, the relaxed, vibrant posture I carried, and the undeniable aura of a woman who was thriving in every possible way. "Sarah," he said again, taking a step forward, his hands trembling slightly beneath the cardboard tray. "My God, you look incredible. I heard about the Seattle project. I wanted to call, but..." He swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a pathetic whisper. "I lost everything, Sarah. Emma left the day after the gala. The creditors took the cars, the accounts. I'm drowning. I was so stupid. I'm so sorry." He was waiting for a reaction. He wanted me to scream at him, to gloat, or to offer him the vindictive, furious speech he had probably rehearsed in his head 1,000 times. He wanted me to show him that he still mattered, that his betrayal still held some kind of emotional weight in my universe. I looked at him, truly looked at him, searching my chest for the heartbreak, the rage, or even the bitter satisfaction of revenge. But there was nothing. The well was completely dry. He wasn't the love of my life, and he wasn't my greatest enemy. He was just a tired, broken man carrying coffee for people who actually did the work. "Excuse me, miss, black coffee." The barista called out, sliding my cup onto the counter. "Thank you," I said to the barista, leaving a generous tip in the jar. I picked up my cup and turned back to Michael. I didn't offer him a scowl, and I didn't offer him forgiveness. I simply looked at him with the polite, distant indifference one reserves for a stranger blocking the exit. "Good luck, Michael," I said, my voice perfectly calm, completely devoid of emotion. I walked past him, pushed open the heavy glass doors of the cafe, and stepped out into the bright, morning sunlight. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. That night, I stood on the stage of the grand auditorium and accepted my medal to a standing ovation. Julian was in the front row, cheering the loudest. When the ceremony was over, we didn't stay for the after-parties or the high society networking. We went back to our hotel, packed our bags, and flew home to Seattle. As the plane banked over the Puget Sound, the water glittering like crushed diamonds below, I leaned my head against Julian's shoulder. He took my hand, his thumb tracing the knuckles of my fingers. I closed my eyes, listening to the steady, comforting rhythm of his breathing. I had spent 15 years building a fortress around a lie, trying to protect a man who was only interested in stealing the bricks. But the destruction of that life wasn't a tragedy. It was a clearing of the site. I had finally built an empire that was entirely my own, and this time, the foundation was unbreakable. A valuable lesson for the listener. If there is one profound, echoing truth to take away from Sarah's journey, it is this: do not sacrifice your foundation to build a pedestal for someone else's ego. For years, Sarah believed that love meant carrying the weight for her partner. She financed his dreams, managed his insecurities, and allowed her own immense talent to serve as the silent scaffolding for his success. She mistakenly equated her exhaustion with devotion, believing that if she just gave him enough, he would eventually value her in return. But a parasite does not respect the host it feeds on. It only resents the host when the resources run dry. We are often socially conditioned to believe that a successful relationship requires endless, unconditional compromise. We convince ourselves that if we just support a toxic partner a little longer, or forgive their continuous disrespect, we will magically fix them. But true partnership is never a rescue mission. True partnership does not require you to shrink your brilliance, drain your bank accounts, or blindly ignore the red flags waving right in front of you. The most powerful moment of Sarah's life was not the grand, public revenge at the gala. Her true victory was the realization in that coffee shop that her abuser's struggles no longer mattered to her. Indifference is the ultimate closure. Remember that you are the primary architect of your own life. Do not hand the blueprints of your future over to someone who hasn't earned the right to read them. If you find yourself constantly pouring your energy into someone who takes the credit while leaving you with the debt, whether emotional or financial, have the courage to walk away. Clear the debris. Reclaim your assets. Happiness is not found in forgiving the unforgivable. It is found in the breathtaking peace that arrives when you finally choose yourself first and welcome the love that stands beside you, rather than on top of you.